coming up.
There's a number of us around the table here that have been to Taiwan on a couple occasions, and General Thibault, I welcome your final remarks there that we have to pick sides.
Several of our allies, including the U.S., Australia, France, Japan, and the European Union, have voiced concern. In contrast, there has been silence from the Government of Canada, from the Minister of Foreign Affairs on down. What do you make of that?
How will Taiwan actually know when the first real shot in a conflict is fired?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
I want to welcome two very familiar witnesses to this committee who've recently been on a keen journey together, and I'm sure they're going to share it with us. Mr. Bazan, 6 minutes. I'm going to go the 6 minute round, and then we have the room till 5:51. That clock is wrong, by the way. And so I may have to cut back on the second round, but let's go for 6 minutes first round.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank both Mr. Fad and General Thibault for coming to committee and for sharing your experience. There's a number of us around the table here that have been to Taiwan on a couple occasions, and General Thibault, I welcome your final remarks there that we have to pick sides, and that it's time to move on and support Taiwan in a more robust manner. So does that, how, and both you yourself and Mr. Fadden talked about the whole issue of multilateral relationships. Is it time for us as Canadians, as the Government of Canada, as Parliament of Canada, to advocate for Taiwan to be a full-fledged member in other international fora, such as World Health Organization and the United Nations?
Chair, absolutely, without any reservation whatsoever. The UN Security Council resolution, which made China the representative of China on the Security Council and in the General Assembly, said absolutely nothing about what Taiwan could do in the specialized agencies and elsewhere. It is, to most people, incomprehensible that Taiwan could not be a member of the WHO or the UNDP or ICAO. So I think if we did this in a clear, step-by-step manner, we could do this without enraging China, because I do think one of our objectives in this, and I agree with General Thibault about picking sides, enraging China is not helpful either. But there's a way of doing this if the government decided they wanted to, in a thoughtful way, push far more than we have for membership.
Okay. With both of your extensive expertise on defense and national security, in your opinion, after being there, and then, just last week we saw the PRC using the PLA Navy and Air Force barricade and institute a 12-hour blockade around Taiwan, both by air and sea. Do you believe Taiwan is ready for conflict with mainland China, especially when you hear the U.S. Pacific Command often reference the fact that they expect to be in war with the PRC by 2027?
Well, Mr. Chair, thanks for the question. I think that we came away with a very clear view from Taipei and the officials that we met with about their determination, their recognition first and foremost that they have to be prepared to go alone, however things unfold, and so they're determined really to be able to defend themselves, and they're putting the investments in asymmetric capabilities. Their defense budget just has gone from I think 1.8% of GDP to 2.5%, and on a trajectory to continue to invest more. And I think that's all with a view to making sure that they're sending the right messages not only to China but to their allies and friends that they're doing what they need to do within the means that they have available to them to be able to defend themselves. Clearly, the issue of what the PRC and the PLA and the PLN are doing is demonstrating, is probing, is continuing to exhaust the Taiwanese Defense Forces through the Taiwanese Defense Forces being required to stay on the highest levels of alert at all time. So they have a strategy which is really, I think, working to exhaust the Taiwanese Defense Forces, and I think they are in a very difficult position. from that perspective. But they're doing everything that they can. And I think that they would welcome other friendly countries to continue to help them make sure that they can defend themselves. And I think that's where we need to be thinking about how Canada might be able to help in the defense.
We saw just yesterday that, in response to the blockade that was instituted, during exercises, I'm not sure when an exercise actually becomes an act of aggression. You would think if you're shut down for 12 hours, that could be interpreted as an act of aggression. But I look at the whole issue that, Canada did sail with, the HMCS Montreal, I believe, went through the Strait of Taiwan yesterday, along with a U.S. destroyer, an Arleigh Burke. What more should Canada be doing to provide military cooperation assistance to Taiwan beyond, sailing through, practicing the freedom of navigation through the Strait of Taiwan?
I think the freedom of the high seas and what we're doing in those transits was surprisingly important to I think all of us about how they appreciated it. So they knew when our ship sailed through, and from that perspective, that obviously resonates with Taipei as being very important. So we need to continue with that. I think to your question, what more to do, I think comes to the last point that Mr. Fadden says. We need to be more creative in terms of allowing, I think, officials to actually engage with the Taiwanese defense and national security organizations. And I would start with, military, political staff talks to sort of identify a number of menu items of what Canada could be doing in cooperation with Taiwan. So to me, there's probably a number of things that we could be doing to help not only in country, but I think institutionally with their efforts to make sure that they can defend themselves properly.
If I look at what's happening to NATO and what's happening south of the U.S., and we see some saber rattling, of course, with former President Trump, that situation's changing. And so when you pick a side, you want to make sure that your team is as strong or stronger than the others. And that's increasingly, I think, more in question as time goes on. And hopefully all of this has to do with the election in terms of his statements. But if some of the things that he's proposed come to fruition and he follows through on them, I think it presents an issue for Canada and its allies in terms of where we go next, especially in the Indo-Pacific region where China is coalescing a stronger group. So with all that said, your take in terms of picking a side under a scenario in which the U.S. might not be as a reliable partner as it has been in the past with a Trump presidency.
Well, I certainly don't want to speculate in terms of U.S. elections. What I would say is they just celebrated the 75th anniversary of NATO in Washington, and I think when you're looking at real alliances versus alliances which are really, when you kind of look at the nations that are coming together, who Russia is picking as their friends, and I think there we're clearly in a world in which I think NATO is still very relevant, and I don't think that, notwithstanding any posturing or any kind of comments that we may be hearing for political purposes, that NATO is at any real risk in terms of continuing to serve our respective nations. I think we all need to burden share. I think that there is a certain continuity with the comments that the former president made in terms of the countries of NATO sharing the burden, and the United States has obviously been the backbone of the Western Alliance. And so we all need to do our part, and I think that extends into other parts of the world. And so the partners with NATO in the Indo-Pacific as well, where we've got partnerships now with NATO, with Japan, South Korea, with Australia, with New Zealand, is to recognize that the world is kind of moving in a way where we've got the friends and we've got those who are not friendly. And I think that from that sense, I would hope that NATO will continue, or should continue, in my view, as being very relevant for the problems of the 21st century.
Mr. Fadden, can I ask you the same?
Just to back up one step, one thing that's clear to me, and I think to General Thibault, is that if China, for any reason, decides to really pop the clutch against Taiwan, the position of the United States is critical. we can delude ourselves as much as we want that we or Japan or Australia can help, and we probably can. But if the United States stood back and did not intervene in the course of the several days, if not a week or two, there's not a lot that Japan or Australia can do. They're the two closest allies, and it would take us a while to mobilize. So having said that, I think Canada's always been a joiner. Sometimes we join everything that's available, but I would argue that in the Indo-Pacific we're not joining the right clubs. And we need to up our association with Japan across the board, not just military, but political and trade. Australia, it's pretty good. There are a number of other countries that are growing at a great rate of not in that part of the world. They're getting to be very good. We tend not to like defense alliances, and I understand why. It's not our history. But in terms of dealing with China, I would submit it's the only thing they understand. So as a possible hedge against the United States not being terribly enthusiastic, I would argue the 3 or 4 or 5 countries that we've both talked about need to start talking yesterday about at least making sure that China understands that if we can't defend them militarily, reject them militarily, there will be severe political, strategic, economic, and trade sanctions instantaneously, because it's not only defense, it's a whole raft of things, I would argue.
I asked senior officials last fall from Global Affairs Canada and NDDN about India, talking about the ongoing military strategic partnerships with the Modi government. We've seen them engage in extrajudicial killings, interference in Canada, and I asked specifically about Canada's cooperation with the India's military engaging in Exercise Sea Dragon. The response I got at the time was only that they would be reassessing engagements into the future. We haven't seen anything change as far as I understand it in that regard. Could you comment on that and whether Canada should reassess those continuing operations?
I think we should, because it seems to me that what has been made public over the course of the last little while has fundamentally shifted our relationship with India. And I know there are a lot of people in Canada who still think back, it's a Commonwealth countries. We were one of the first ones that recognized it in our independence. There are a lot of personal connections. But the people who are running India right now care not one whit about any of that. And we certainly need to find a way, in my view anyway, to maintain communications. We can't break diplomatic relations. I think there's been an agreement. We'll continue on the trade front. But I would argue, and this is not directed exclusively at the current government, we've done this in Canada over the decades, we have a tendency of registering objections to things and not doing anything. So maybe we can register the objection and at least suspend, if not terminate, some of these arrangements. That would be my view, while acknowledging that we have to keep up diplomatic relations. We have to find a way of continuing to talk. But, the Prime Minister and ministers have been very, very blunt in their views of China, but they've only articulated their view. I don't think we have done anything. And I think India will not register our concern unless we do something.
Would a fair assessment be potentially the banning of the RSS or naming them as a terrorist organization in this country, as has been requested by the World Sikh Organization and many Muslim organizations?
I'm not sure that the criteria that we currently apply would make it such that it would be easy to ban the RSS. I haven't looked at that for a long time. But to call them a terrorist organization, point final, I'm not sure. But there must be some ways of registering our concerns other than simply saying so, however forcefully.
The conversations that we just heard and the conversations about, joining the Quad and so on, that includes India. So how does that color or change a response in that regard?
If you join a club, it doesn't mean you love everybody equally. I think that's true in personal life, and I would argue that in international relations it's also true. If the majority of the members of the Quad are our allies and there's somebody there that we don't really like, we can use it as an opportunity to push back on them. So I would not sort of say we can't join because India's there. we should use every opportunity we can with our allies to push back in those organizations.
Do you feel the same way in terms of potentially the expulsion of certain diplomats, whether they be, Chinese, Russian, Indian?
Well,
Very briefly, please.
all I can say is in a large chunk of my career in working in national security, I tried to convince GAC and its ministers to expel people from a number of countries on which we had fairly decent information, and that's a very difficult thing to do.
We're going to leave it there, and we're not going to be asking for details. Mr. Cooper, welcome to the committee. Hang on for a second here. So we got 20 minutes. 20 minutes for 6 questions. That's not going to work. Is it 3 minutes a question? Okay. You're down to 3 minutes, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Last week, we saw a significant escalation by the Beijing regime with a military exercise off the Taiwan Strait that included 153 aircraft, 36 naval and Coast Guard breaks. Several of our allies, including the U.S., Australia, France, Japan, and the European Union, have voiced concern. In contrast, there has been silence from the Government of Canada, from the Minister of Foreign Affairs on down. What do you make of that?
Well, first, if I could to say that what China undertook was not a surprise. First of all, they expected that when President Lei was going to have on his on the Independence Day speech that they were going to demonstrate, and so they've characterized President Lei as a separatist, and so bottom line is there was nothing that was unanticipated about what they did. The problem, I think, in some respects, is that the peaceful status quo in the Taiwan Straits, upon which we've said we're going to maintain our policy of strategic ambiguity and our one China policy, all without wanting to harm or put at risk the peaceful status quo in the Taiwan Straits. It's changing every day, and the status quo isn't peaceful.
My time is brief.
Yeah.
Should the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Government of Canada, join her allies in condemning that escalation?
I think so.
Mr. Fadden?
I agree.
Okay. When we talk about engagement with Taiwan, often the pushback is Canada's one China policy. Now, the joint communique that sets out Canada's one China policy says that Canada merely takes note of Beijing's contention that Taiwan is part of the PRC. It does not endorse that in any way, shape, or form, and quite deliberately so. And so often we see the one China policy conflated with Beijing's very different one China principle. So can you just on that elaborate a little bit about the significant flexibility the policy provides and how Canada might leverage that?
But I mean, first of all, as I was trying to say in my remarks, the one China policy is our policy. If we want to change it, we can change it. If we want to interpret it differently, we can interpret it differently. I happen to be of the view that if we do that, we should do so with our allies as much as we can. But it's like any other policy of the Government of Canada. If it is our policy, we can change it. I believe, and I think General Thibault agrees, that the current government interprets it rather conservatively or restrictively. But I don't think we should interpret it so broadly that, to use my expression, we enrage China. But I think there's a fair bit of space there that would enable us to do a great deal more.
This past weekend, and I think my colleague was trying to refer to it, Canada certainly successfully completed a joint transit through the Strait with a frigate of HMCS Vancouver alongside the U.S. destroyer Higgins. This transit was completed in a safe and certainly in a professional manner, but we know that this is unfortunately has not been the case for all transit and certainly for us and some partners. I would really like you both to speak on the danger of interfering with the transit and the diplomatic implementation of it, please.
I think that the rules of conduct that we had, say, at the height of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and Allied forces were pretty well demarcated about how to work together to avoid sort of having an event that would snowball, and I think we don't have that in place with the PRC today. And I think that's one of the challenges that we see in the South China Sea, in the coast, off the coast of Japan and South Korea, and off of Taiwan. And so we are seeing them undertake quite dangerous activities, and there is the potential for an act that would result in casualties. In fact, there was an event with fishers off of the island of Kinmen recently, and so I think this is one of the concerns, and I think this is one of the reasons why you actually need to continue to engage with China, notwithstanding the fact that we're picking friends and choosing sides. You still need to keep the lines of communications open with your adversaries to avoid things that would complicate things as a result of miscalculation or behaviors which create an accident and kill people.
I think that's right. I'm going to be more practical and sort of say that we're arguably living in one of the most dangerous periods since World War II, and I don't think any country on the planet wants war. What worries me more than anything is a mistake, is an accident. And what I think General Thibault was saying, if I interpreted him correctly, is we have no protocols to deal with accidents, including Russian bombers and fighters that go down most of our coast. We scramble RCAF jets to keep an eye on them, but what if something goes wrong and one of them blows, they blow each other up? There are no real protocols to deal with this, so that's why I think the General is right. We absolutely have to keep pounding the Chinese for a protocol to deal with accidents. But we can't stop, because if we stop and the Allies stop going through the Straits, the Chinese will take them over, and that will be the beginning of the end.
Madame Normandin.
I've heard a number of concerns from the Filipino diaspora who are concerned about the Indo-Pacific strategy and our goal of expanding military capacity, building initiatives with regional partners, which also lists the Philippines. And yet their current government has, taken part in horrific human rights violations. And as General Thibault had mentioned, that we need to be careful of those who are hostile to our interests, and I would consider, human rights protections and so on, our interests. So how do we adapt that Indo-Pacific strategy so that we're not empowering regimes working against those interests to uphold the international rules-based order?
I'm probably not best person to ask this question of, because I think the Indo-Pacific strategy was largely, on the part of the government, an opportunity to revise its policy on China. It was the first time that the government called China an adversary, strategic adversary, and the rest of it was all very important, but I think that was the core of it all. It changed its view on China, which I think was highly desirable. I think we have a great deal of flexibility in how we implement the Indo-Pacific strategy, and you may disagree with me on this, but I think that despite the fact that we likely share the view that human rights are important, we have to have relations with some countries that violate human rights, because the only way we're going to change them is as we dialogue with them. There are any number of countries in that part of the world that don't share our views on the rule of law, and a whole bunch of other things. But I think that failing to deal with them through the Indo-Pacific strategy will only make it worse over time. We already have a problem in the world about the West sort of restraining itself, and a lot of countries tending towards China and Russia on a whole variety of fronts. It's an imperfect answer to your question, but it's the best I can do. I don't know if the General can do better.
Answer to her question.
Sorry.
So Ms. Gallant, 3 minutes.
So just to make sure I get both questions in fulsome answers, I'm going to ask both at once. Earlier today, the PLA conducted large-scale live fire exercises on its island closest Taiwan, which is only 66 miles away. How will Taiwan actually know when the first real shot in a conflict is fired? That's question number one. And the West has underestimated PLA's technological progress in the past. And so we expect a war by 2027. But in your estimation, can an armed invasion of Taiwan happen sooner than that?
I know there's a lot of speculation about what PLA may or may not do, and I don't think anybody really knows. I mean, we've heard the Davidson 2027. We've heard Xi Jinping saying for the centennial that they need to be prepared for the reunification of Greater China. But what I would say is that how will we know? Well, I think what Taiwan has said, they're going to do nothing to provoke China. So it will be they're going to take the first shots. So they'll take the first shots, and that will be the shot that's going to change the course of perhaps that region based on what the PLA is doing. And I think this is one of the concerns about all of their posturing and their the exercises that they're doing, the testing, is to say, is this real or isn't it? Is this when they're going or not? And we saw with Russia, building up with Ukraine, and the Americans were saying it's going to happen. They could see all the indicators. And I think with China, we'll have those same indicators. And what I think is probably true is that what we're seeing for the nature of the exercise they have, even though they're really impressive and they're very significant, the rest of all the logistics that would have to follow, all of the things that would have to happen on the mainland, I think that the United States for sure will be telegraphing what China is doing to the rest of the world as well, with their intentions based on the intelligence that we'll have on what China is doing. So, I don't think that there's any real risk in the short run. I don't think that's kind of the view that we saw in Taiwan, that they're expecting to be invaded tomorrow. I don't think the conditions are there, and I think that in some respects China's changing the status quo without having to do that, and I think China would prefer that, because it's a hard military nut to crack in terms of Taiwan. If you've been there, and I think a number of the members of the committee have been there, you'll just get the sense for it. It's a mountainous region. It's a rainforests, tropical. There's very few accesses to sort of undertake an amphibious assault on the island, and it's not an easy problem to sort of I think take Taiwan. And I think China is watching what's going on with how the West has reacted to Ukraine, how the Ukrainians themselves have responded to them, and I think that they're taking note. So I think that would be kind of my take. I think we all walked away thinking that it's not like an imminent problem in terms of that China is about to invade Taiwan.
Can I add 2 sentences to that? I think you have to define what's the first shot, whether it's kinetic or whether it's cyber. If China closes down Taiwan's electrical grid, or it closes down its telecommunications with the outside world, currently, my understanding is that international law does not recognize that as an act of war. A few years ago, it would have been, because it's the same as being bombed. So my only suggestion, I agree entirely with what the General is saying, but I think we, this country in the West, have to develop a more comprehensive definition of what the first shot is. Because the Russians certainly had a number of first shots in the cyber world, and it facilitated their kinetic invasion. Sorry.
Thank you, Ms. Gallant. Final 3 minutes, Madame Lampropoulos.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here to answer some questions. I'm going to take us back to an earlier part of the conversation where you both said in your testimony that we need to do more, we can do more, and that a lot of our allies are doing more, that regardless of what it is that we decide to do, we shouldn't do on our own, and we should do with our allies. So can you give us some concrete examples of what they are doing that doesn't, that is not stepping too far and is not setting off any alarms, I guess, that too strong of an alarm for China?
I mean, I'm going to exclude the United States because they're in a category of their own. They do a whole raft of things, from the purely military all the way off the spectrum. So if we put them aside, the Australians and a number of others, for example, promote high-level visits. I know that sounds childish, but in terms of international relations, it sends a message that they're supportive. couple of the countries have better trade deals. You know, we've been working with Taiwan for a while to improve our trade arrangements. I think we could probably do more. General Thibault's suggestion that we could do a variety of things at the staff level with the military. We could promote, you know, they're very keen, they have an indigenous population, they're very keen on learning how we're dealing with our indigenous population, and we're doing a little bit on that. Maybe we could do more. But it's the sort of thing that, you know, I suspect if you ask the Library of Parliament, they could give you 2 or 3 pages of examples. And what's lacking, I think, is an acceptance on the part of ministers that there is going to be a pushback and how much they're prepared to take before they say no. I argue we should do more, but there's a balancing act there somewhere. I don't know, Guy, if you want to add.
Well, I must admit we didn't perhaps have the opportunity to really get a sense what all the rest of the partners are doing with Taiwan when we were there. But I think in the security and defense domain, clearly our policies have been restrictive rather than permissive. And I think that we should be moving in a direction where if peace, stability, and security in the Taiwan Strait or in the Indo-Pacific is the first objective of our Indo-Pacific strategy, then, you know, we should think about the relationship that we have with Taiwan from that perspective. And I think that right now, in defense and the Canadian Armed Forces, I can attest to the fact, at least from when I was serving, we had no relationship with Taiwan and no intersections with them. So I think that that's where I would start with our engagement, is really, at least in the defense and security sector, is to really look at some policy military staff connections to identify the opportunities that we would have with them. And I can think of all kinds, whether it be for humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, they're a conscription military, they're having struggles with their training. I think that in terms of their operational experience, they're not an operationally experienced kind of military. They are defensive and reacting to the probes that they've got, but ultimately in the conduct of operations, I think they would benefit by other partners other than the United States helping them with kind of their institutional development and the strengthening of their armed forces. And so I think there's many things that could be done, but we have to start talking to them before we can really identify what the real issues where we add some real value to them.
To Madame Lambropoulos. Unfortunately, this brings it to a close, and I say unfortunate quite sincerely because, colleagues, I think we have benefited mightily by the wisdom and insights of both of you. I know it's trite to say thank you for your service, but both of you, thank you for your service to Canada over many, many years, and we really appreciate your coming to the committee and talking to us.